Hey there guys, today we're going to be comparing the performance of the TRIGKEY Speed S5 mini PC rocking the Ryzen 5 5500U up against the SER6 Max rocking the Ryzen 7 7735HS. Now you might be thinking, why the hell are we comparing these two systems? Mostly just because I kind of wanted to, but really these two systems, the thing that connects the two of them is mostly the fact that actually the SER6 Max is essentially double the price of the Speed S5. And what that had me curious is if we're essentially getting a doubling of our performance, at least when it comes to gaming. Because a lot of the times when it comes to computer hardware, you might end up spending twice as much money, but you're not getting twice as much performance for something. Sometimes you might be spending twice as much money to get around 30%. So let's see if the price difference between the two systems here is actually justified and what exactly we can get out of both of them. So let's jump right on in. So starting off the gaming comparison, here we have Red Dead Redemption 2 running with the lowest in-game graphics settings, and we are using FSR at the performance preset, and we do have the texture set to ultra. Now in this game we do see a pretty stark difference between the two systems. It's pretty clear that on the TRIGKEY Speed S5, we're really not getting anywhere near a playable experience, while on the SER6 Max, we are actually getting a very close to 60 FPS average, and those 1% lows are more than clearing the minimum 30 FPS that we want to see. So this is beautiful performance versus what is essentially not even able to meet the bare minimum. And again, we're already using FSR at the performance preset on both of these. But going from the TRIGKEY to the SER6 Max, we actually end up seeing a 112% increase in the FPS average and an even larger 131% increase in those 1% lows. This is some insane gains here. And considering that the price difference between these two systems is essentially double the price of the TRIGKEY, we are at least doubling performance here, and it is pushing us to a level where not only is it playable, it's a really great experience. Now following that up though, we have one of the games that showed the biggest gains, and that is Rainbow Six Siege here, where while both are playable experiences, going from the TRIGKEY to the SER6 Max, we end up seeing a 174% increase in the FPS average, and our 1% lows saw a 160% increase. So it's essentially going from a 60 FPS average, which is still rock solid, to an almost 200 FPS average, which means we can actually take full advantage of a high refresh rate display. These are some insane gains, especially considering that if this is a title you want to play, yeah, it's double the cost for the system, but you're more than doubling your performance. Now, not every title is going to see triple-digit performance gains, but we're still going to see some pretty massive differences here. With Batman Arkham Knight running with the lowest in-game graphics settings at the full 1080p resolution, here you can see that both systems are actually able to give you a playable experience, so there is again a pretty noticeable difference between the two here, where from the TRIGKEY to the Beelink, we end up seeing a massive 80% increase in the FPS average and a 51% increase in the 1% lows. So not triple digits, but still some massive gains that are essentially going to take you from a 30 FPS average to a 60 FPS average. It's essentially the difference that you would expect to see between console generations. Now, Assassin's Creed Mirage is the most recently released title that we're going to be taking a look at today, and it is also another one that showed some massive gains, where there is a 169% uplift in the FPS average and a 172% uplift in the 1% lows. So the difference here is going from an unplayable experience to a 60 FPS average. Now again, FSR is doing a lot to help out here, but FSR can't even save the Speed S5 here. So if being able to play brand new AAA titles is important to you, well, the SER6 Max and any system running this specific chip is pretty much where you should be looking at. Now the next title we're taking a look at is Deus Ex Mankind Divided. This is running with the lowest in-game graphics settings, and it is another title that saw triple-digit performance increases. This has always been a title that really would bring these Ryzen 5 mini PCs to their knees. None of them really were ever ever packed with any iGPU that was strong enough to handle this right. And in comparison here, the Ryzen 7 is taking a very, very commanding lead, giving us an almost 60 FPS gaming experience. And here we end up seeing a 111% increase in the FPS average, and the 1% lows also ended up seeing a 105% increase. Now, Grid 2 is another title that I really enjoyed testing just to get performance for older titles, and it still visually looks really well at the ultra graphics settings, which is what we're using here. And while both systems give a very playable experience, there is a pretty massive difference between the two, where the FPS average ends up seeing a 73% uplift and the 1% lows end up seeing an 68% uplift. Now, not the biggest gains that we've seen thus far, but still a pretty commanding difference here. And again, shows that there is some pretty major differences between these two systems. And though there is a doubling in terms of price, considering that in some of the titles that we've seen so far, you get more than double a performance uplift, it can be pretty compelling, but this does show that not every title is going to hit that at least double mark, but we are pretty close to it. And another older title that I love coming back to is Bioshock Infinite, here running with the ultra graphics settings. And while both systems are able to at least get an above 30 FPS average, again, the SER6 Max ends up seeing an 80% higher FPS average and a 53% higher 1% low. And this overall is going to lead to a pretty massive difference in terms of how this game is going to feel when you're playing it. And the last game that we're going to be taking a look at is Mountain Blade 2 Bannerlord, here running with the lowest in-game graphics settings. And both systems end up hitting a above 30 FPS average pretty decently, though the speed S5 isn't able to clear that for the 1% lows. And in general, going with the SER6 Max, we end up seeing an almost 90% increase in the FPS average, but more importantly, those 1% lows actually end up seeing a 150% increase in general, leading to a far smoother and more consistent experience. This is pretty massive, and it's really the kinds of gains that you want to see more than anything else. If your 1% lows see some massive gains like that, that just means you're going to have a very great time. So after running those gaming benchmarks, what can I really say about these two systems? Again, I know it's a weird comparison, and really we were just mostly doing it for fun. There's not really any meaningful comparison to be had here other than to show what it is that you would essentially get if you spent twice the money on a mini PC. If gaming is something that really matters to you, it can actually be worthwhile. And it is an interesting scenario, just in case if you were thinking of maybe instead of going with a TRIGKEY, you'd go with a SER5 Max, or really just go with any system that has a Ryzen 5 and instead go with something like the 5800H, which personally I think is a great chip, don't get me wrong, but the performance difference between the 5500U and the 5800H isn't as massive as the differences that we're seeing here, and that's just going to be essentially an extra $100 to $150 on top of that. Now, if none of that matters to you, the lower TDP and overall cooler performance that you're going to be getting out of the TRIGKEY is going to make it a compelling product, and in general they really target two different market segments. The TRIGKEY is really more of your everyday type computer, while you get something like the SER6 Max because you want something compact but also packing a lot of graphics performance. But it definitely was interesting to see how the two fared against each other, and in a lot of ways I actually came out having a lot more respect for the SER6 Max as a product in general, because I think it hits a nice sweet spot in terms of price to performance where it doesn't completely become irrelevant due to desktops. Really, to build something that is going to be meaningfully more performant, you're going to be looking at a much bigger box that is more than likely going to have to use used parts or a lot of budget parts that end up having a lot of compromises on their own. Though of course DIY is always a good option. I think if you're looking for a mini PC that can game, the SER6 Max is really the way to go, at least as a starting point.